When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, and welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about Alicent Hightower, what went on in her life, and kind of who she was as a person. If you don't know, Alicent Hightower was the main leading person of the green side in the Dance with Dragons. And yeah, but before we get into this video, if you guys would like to subscribe, like, and comment for more of this type of content, please do. Helps the channel grow and reach other people that might like this content. Alright, so getting into Alicent Hightower, she is an interesting character because she's a very morally gray character. You definitely see where she's coming from, but with that being said, she is one of my least favorite characters because I am a big Rhaenyra fan. I really like her. She's one of my favorite characters within the entire Song of Ice and Fire universe or whatnot. So yeah, getting into this video, she was born in 88 AC, and for the most part, her early life was kind of just at Old Town, nothing crazy until her father becomes Hand of the King at the age of 13. Now, as I've talked about in my Otto Hightower video about his character and his story as well, Otto Hightower kind of was becoming the ruler for King Jaehaerys in his later years. King Jaehaerys, I think, was only alive for about 2 more years after Otto Hightower took the responsibilities as Hand of the King. Jaehaerys was very much kind of dying away at this point and was in this point of where he was really just bedridden for the most part. And this is where Alicent, in my opinion, really got into the view or spotlight of a lot of the other Targaryens because she realistically was one of Jaehaerys' closest companions. She would read to him, sing to him, kind of help him if he needed things like that. Almost kind of like a maid, but with other things involved there. And eventually there would be rumors that there was more than that going on, where Alicent was actually maybe having an affair with Jaehaerys or something like that. Personally, don't believe in that. And that's not the first rumor we're going to see of Alicent losing her maidenhead. But this one I definitely don't think is true. I just think this was a good elaborate plan where I think Otto Hightower put Alicent in this situation where she would be close to Jaehaerys. Therefore, you know, kind of meeting Viserys and meeting some of these other, you know, people, where if there was a possible way that he could, you know, Otto Hightower, get Alicent married into the Targaryen family, then she'd be in a good, you know, place. The Hightowers were a very powerful family. Alicent was already here. You know, she was described as being very beautiful. So really good move there from Otto Hightower, and then Alicent Hightower, you know, as we see later on, this would happen. But as I said before, Jaehaerys does end up dying, and realistically, Jaehaerys dies while Alicent is reading to him, which is kind of weird, but, you know, hey, I guess it's, you know, her voice was soothing, and Jaehaerys died peacefully. Now, not long after this, we also come to the idea that Daemon and Otto Hightower did not like each other, right? So Viserys takes the throne, and Otto Hightower, you know, keeps his role as Hand of the King. He did a pretty good job for Jaehaerys when he was ruling as well. And we get this idea that Daemon may or may not have taken Alicent's maidenhead. Now, this one is a lot more believable because Daemon is very lustful. We know that for certain. And was very bold and stuff like that. And it's something that he's someone that would have been attractive to someone like an Alicent or one of these younger maids and stuff like that. I just don't think it happened. I don't really see Daemon doing that because there's not a lot of evidence to support that this ever happened. And if anything, I think Otto Hightower already hated Daemon for other reasons. But looking at my Maester Conspiracy Theory videos, I've kind of explained their relationship a bit more. And I also have a video that talks about their relationship. So if you guys want to see more in depth on that, I would watch those videos specifically. I'm not going to try to talk about it too much in this video because it is an Alicent video. But more or less, I just think there was more going on between Daemon and Otto Hightower than just, oh, Otto Hightower may or may not have believed that Daemon slept with Alicent and took her maidenhead. Getting further into the story, Alicent would kind of continue to age, play a role at court, and be one of the ladies there at court, and would catch the eye of Viserys. And Viserys would eventually lose his wife. His wife would die. And Rhaenyra was the only child that Viserys had at this point, right? And this leaves an interesting situation because King Viserys was in his 30s. It was very well assumed that he needed to have a second wife to give him more children and to create more heirs. And his whole council kind of agreed on a really, really younger woman, right? And this is where I think is a very suspicious thing that's going on here is that, you know, a maester specifically says, okay, Viserys, you should, you know, marry this younger woman. I think she was either 12 or 13 in the books, maybe even younger. I'm not completely sure on that. I don't completely remember. But with that being said, Otto Hightower then goes, well, what about Alicent? And you're sitting here going, why were there only 2 options given for the King of Westeros? And Alicent, being 18, very beautiful, you know, past like puberty and all that stuff, very matured and stuff like that, and has already been here at court, has already caught Viserys' eye, he chooses Alicent easily. Now, Alicent is someone that had a very good relationship with Rhaenyra early on. It's really not until, you know, Viserys and Alicent start having kids that this kind of relationship starts to sour. Because Alicent and Otto Hightower specifically start to kind of push for Alicent's children to be the rightful heirs. Rhaenyra is not going to settle for that. She has been, you know, said that she's the heir from Viserys since she was born, and Viserys has always backed her on that. So, with this being said, Alicent does give birth to 3 children right away, and Aegon, Helaena, and Aemond. Aegon and Helaena would eventually get married, but that's a little further down the road. And with that being said, I think also this was kind of something where it was more about kind of attention, right? Because both of these 2 ladies, you know, Rhaenyra and Alicent, wanted to be kind of the first lady of Westeros. And Rhaenyra, for really her whole life, had been the darling of Westeros, the darling of King's Landing. And here comes Alicent, who's 18, she's beautiful, she's the new queen. You kind of start to see that divide, and it's things like that that really start to make these 2 separate in their relationship. With all that being said, as I'd said earlier, Otto Hightower starts to kind of press on Aegon should be the heir, and that Alicent's children should realistically be where, you know, the throne should go. And Viserys doesn't like this. Otto keeps pressuring him, and Otto Hightower is actually removed from office. Now, even though Otto Hightower is removed from office, a lot of the powerful lords, the friends of Otto Hightower, do stay in really support of Alicent and her children's claims to the throne. In 111 AC, a tourney is actually held in King's Landing to celebrate the 5th anniversary of their relationship of Alicent with Viserys, and we see kind of where the Greens and Blacks get their nicknames, right? So Alicent kind of shows up in the green look, where, you know, the Otto, you know, the Tower look, and then you have Rhaenyra in the black and kind of red, which is, you know, the Targaryen colors, and that's kind of where we have this divide. And this is kind of before Criston Cole turns to the Greens. At this point, he had still been wearing Rhaenyra's favor and been a supporter of the Blacks, and he does end up winning this tournament. Now, one of the most interesting things that I had actually overlooked in my first few readings of The Dance with Dragons is that when Rhaenyra was needed to be married, she was of the age now, she was, I believe, 16, Alicent actually provided a really good idea that was never really backed and was never really thought of again. Aegon II, which is Alicent's first child, should have been married to Rhaenyra. This makes perfect sense. It would have mended the 2 groups together, and there wouldn't have been this infighting anymore. Now, the downsides would have been Rhaenyra and Aegon didn't really get along, which is something Viserys points out. And Viserys also says something that I think is very interesting. Viserys says to Alicent that you're just trying to get, you know, your children and, you know, your family onto the throne, which is something really weird to say to someone that you're married to. But because, if anything, you've already allowed them to do that, Viserys. But, you know, he just is trying to make Rhaenyra the heir. I feel like this is a good match, even though it probably would not have been a happy relationship. But I think Alicent, this is one of the times where you really see her political conniving and understanding that this would have been good for the kingdoms. Everybody gets what they want. Rhaenyra would have been the queen, right? She would have gotten her children on the throne with Aegon II. it just makes perfect sense for both sides outside of the fact that it wouldn't have been a good marriage. And we see all the time forced marriages. I mean, the marriage Rhaenyra gets is probably even worse, right? Because the person she ends up marrying is gay. So they really don't have a relationship at all. And I don't know. I feel like if this is such a pivotal point where this could have been stopped, the Dance of the Dragons could have been stopped right here with this maneuver. But that didn't happen, and we must continue on. Only 3 years later, in 114 AC, after the tournament in which Criston Cole won, Criston Cole actually flips to the green side and actually becomes Alicent's, closest ally, someone that is always guarding her, kind of like how he was with Rhaenyra. Now, again, I have a video about what I think happened there, but to sum it up, I think realistically, Rhaenyra turned down Criston Cole, and I think Criston Cole wanted her. And after that didn't happen, I think Criston Cole just went to the green side. More or less, that is what I believe happened. Another year passes by, and Alicent has her next kid, Prince Daeron. And the next major thing that happens within Alicent's life is we have this incident where Aemond actually loses one of his eyes. It's one of his key, features that we see within the books, as well as in they did like a little comedic type thing for, I believe, one of the seasons in Game of Thrones. I'm not sure, but I know I've seen like the whole Dance of Dragons just animated and stuff. This actually makes Viserys kind of separate the two groups, which is good in theory, except you just put them on two different spots and hope it's going to cool down, and it doesn't. You put the greens realistically in the King's Landing, and then you move the blacks to Dragonstone. Now, this is another thing that I think is very similar to what Robert does with Stannis. This is meant to be a good thing, right? Because Rhaenyra is the heir, so she goes to Dragonstone, and this is normally where the heir goes. But it puts Rhaenyra at such a big disadvantage because she's not there to be playing the political game and gaining favor and continuing to be the darling girl of Westeros. And it kind of allows Alicent to have more influence on what is going on in King's Landing, the capital, where the Iron Throne is in general. And shortly after they have this separation, funny enough, King Viserys ends up dying. Now, because Rhaenyra is not there, and most of the blacks are not as well, I mean, they have their spies there and some people that still support them there, but most of, the Black Council is on Dragonstone. So Viserys dies, and, the servant that ends up finding this only tells Alicent. Now, this is key because Alicent doesn't want this to get out right away. Because if she can kind of keep this to herself and keep this away from the general public, she can plan what to do. Now, she assembles this Green Council more or less. There's only one person that really backs Rhaenyra, and he is killed or imprisoned then killed. But the main three figures at this meeting are Alicent, Criston Cole, and Otto Hightower. Now, Otto Hightower had been brought back earlier to be, the Hand of the King again after the former Hand of the King that Viserys had for a few years had died. And they're all looking to make Aegon II the king. Now, for Alicent personally, I want to talk about what her reasoning for why she wanted to do this. I think it is pretty clear, but I want to touch on her specifically. Alicent kind of how someone like Cersei thinks in the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire. She wants Joffrey to ascend the throne, right? Even though she knows that Joffrey is not the true, ruler, right? Or the next heir that really should be in line because of her and Jaime. And if we look at what Alicent is doing here, she herself knows Rhaenyra is the right heir, right? She knows Rhaenyra should be the heir. But she sees this opportunity to kind of get her family in more power and her herself more power. By doing this, you look at Alicent and Cersei in this part of their lives, they're very similar in that way. And Alicent goes ahead, they crown Aegon II, and she does this more or less to put her blood, her family on the throne. And this, of course, will start the Dance with Dragons. The next thing that does happen in Alicent's life is something that is very tragic, and is, I think, one of the darkest scenes that George has ever written. It is kind of what happens after Luke Valerion is actually killed by Aemon Targaryen, the messenger that had went to the Baratheons. If you don't know, Rhaenyra had sent out all of her children to kind of get, their alliances and get their supporters. And Rhaenyra had believed that the Baratheons would back her claim, which seemed like a reasonable thing to think. One way or another, it didn't go well, and Aemon ends up killing Luke Valerion, one of Rhaenyra's children. Rhaenyra being upset, and, it makes sense why. Or Daemon ends up going to her, hey, let's get vengeance. A son for a son. And we end up with this scene where Alicent is more or less tied up, gagged, watching as her daughter Helena, who had been married to Aegon II earlier on, like I'd mentioned, has to choose between which two of her children she is going to kill. Now, the way that this ends up happening and how this even came to be was that Helena always went to see her mother and took her children every night. They would do this every single night. So it was a rotation that as two assassins would come in who knew the cast really well and knew Daemon, they were able to easily kind of get into this idea, get to Alicent's chambers, kill the guard, whoever was there, and then do their thing there. And then when Helena comes in with her children, they're going to kill one of the children. Now, Helena kind of sits there for a while, not being able to choose. I mean, think about this. As a mother trying to choose which one of your kids you're going to kill. She ends up going with the younger child because in her mind, I mean, you're trying to find some justification for why you're going to kill one of your children. And it's because he's younger. He doesn't really know what's going on as much. And like a good villain, they do the opposite. They end up killing Aegon's son, Jaehaerys. And that is a tragic scene that will haunt Helena for the rest of her life, as well as Alicent as well. But the big thing here is that because Helena can't really do anything here, I mean, can you just imagine the horror of having to make that decision and then living with that for the rest of your life, that because of you, one of your children died? You chose which child. She goes into depression and is really not in a state to be able to watch over, her last child, which is Maelor. Now, Maelor kind of becomes the son of Alicent morally, because Aegon II, seeing all of that, what just happened, goes, okay, Alicent, my mom, or his mom, can you watch over my son? And she ends up doing that and all of that, and, all that plays out. But what I'm saying off that scene alone is that is going to be the Red Wedding for House of the Dragon. I am super excited to see what they do with that. I know this is not part of the video, but it's something I wanted to include since I'm going over, through my notes and stuff like that. I cannot wait for how they do that scene within the show. And yeah, I hope you guys are as well. But let's continue on as we get further into the dance. The next major thing that, Alicent is kind of involved in is kind of the part where Otto Hightower is getting removed from the office of the Hand of the King. Now, Aegon II had started to grow very kind of impulsive and wanted to see more action and results, right? It was something that, I very much look at like Joffrey. Joffrey was very much like, why aren't we doing something? Why aren't we going after Robb? Why aren't we doing all these things? That's kind of how Aegon II was. Now, Alicent tries her best to defend her father and say that, he's doing a good job, which in reality, he was actually doing a good job. If you watch my Otto Hightower video, it's very similar to this style of the video where it's going through his life and stuff like that. He was doing a lot of things in the background that people just didn't see yet, and it was something that came into play later on. But Aegon II doesn't listen. His brother Aemond and Criston Cole take a lot of their forces, plus, a big dragon, and they go out to try to meet Daemon, who is at Harrenhal at this point, which leaves King's Landing super undefended. Rhaenyra ends up taking the castle, and Alicent ends up yielding up King's Landing because of kind of the stupidity of Aegon II. Now, Aegon II does get away. He's not captured in this, but not a good strategy there, right? You lose King's Landing, the power seat of Westeros. The big move for Rhaenyra, and the war seems to be going very badly for the Greens at this point. And the horror really continues for Alicent as she has to watch, you know, her brother die, her father die. It's a very tragic time. And then as Rhaenyra is in control of the city, Helena, her daughter, also kills herself. It is a rough period for Alicent as she's seen, you know, her daughter die at this point. She has seen some of her grandchildren die at this point. Her father's dead. Her brother's dead. Alicent is going through a lot right now, and we see this is a very big parallel between Alicent and Rhaenyra, the two main people when we talk about the blacks and the greens at the very beginning. They both kind of start to have this mental breakdown where I don't like saying people are crazy because they're going through a lot of stress and or depression at this point, and it just only gets worse for Alicent as Aemond dies fighting Daemon. Maelor dies at Bitterbridge. My bad. It's hard to say that. And things just are not going well for Alicent. Okay, they're just not going well. You know, she's watched majority of her children die except for Aegon II. She's watched majority of her grandchildren die. She has, I think, one grandchild left, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But you can see how this would completely destroy someone. Look how it destroys Rhaenyra after she's lost, or in her mind, all but one of her children. It destroys Alicent as a person. But with this being said, Alicent does agree to betroth Aegon II to Cassandra Baratheon, as well as the safekeeping of Jaehaera Targaryen. Now, this was done because Aegon II had just lost his wife, and he needed to, again, have more heirs. Very similar to the thing of why Viserys needed to remarry. Now, like I just said, Jaehaera Targaryen is also kind of shipped to the Baratheons for safekeeping and stuff like that. And Jaehaera Targaryen is the last kind of grandchild that Alicent actually has at this point, so very important to keep her in safekeeping. As we see the conclusion of the Dance with Dragons, where Rhaenyra, you know, ends up going back to Dragonstone, and Aegon II ends up killing her, basically letting Sunfire eat her. Aegon II comes back, and Alicent very reluctantly agrees to marry her last grandchild, Jaehaera Targaryen, to Aegon III. Now, this was something that Alicent was very reluctant to do because Aegon III was of Rhaenyra's bloodline and all that. But what gets even worse for Alicent is she loses her last child. Aegon II is poisoned by the Sea Snake and some of his council members. Really, this is because Aegon II was a bad king, in my opinion. He made a lot of terrible decisions after the end of the war and trying to bring peace to Westeros. He reminds me a lot of when you look at like Reconstruction in America after the Civil War, where that whole situation was just really badly handled, and it kind of created more of a rift than it did heal the actual country. And that is kind of what Aegon II ended up doing, and we see a lot of the after effects when you look at the period after the Dance with Dragons. With this being said, Alicent is also arrested by the Sea Snake, just for being a Targaryen and being part of the Greens and stuff like that, and she would never accept her own child being poisoned and stuff, so this is more of just a move by the Sea Snake. Eventually, though, she is freed by Cragen Stark, as he comes down to kind of sort all this madness out, and he was going to be a big supporter of Rhaenyra, but at this point she was already dead. And I think this is where Alicent as a character really broke. Like, she'd always been depressed and stuff like that, but she at least always had her last child in Aegon II, but this just kind of broke her. We see her kind of not really wanting to do anything, and she does not even attend the wedding of her last grandchild, Jaehaera Targaryen, and that kind of sums up where Alicent goes as a character. She's not really talked about much more in the story, and Tywin Lannister, who at this point was the new Hand of the King, kind of confides her to Maegor's Holdfast, and she really lives out the rest of her life being someone that is talking to herself, kind of almost in this mad state where she's talking to her old children and saying she wants her old children and stuff like that. Or not her old children, but like her children that are dead at this point. And It's one of the last things we hear Alicent say is that she hated the color green. And that is something that I think sums up the themes of George R. R. Martin's writing perfectly, where war was so horrifying and so horrible. As you look at the two main figureheads of both sides and what came out of this whole Dance of the Dragons, right? Rhaenyra loses all of her children but one in her own mind, right? We end up, that's not true. You know, two of her sons end up living. Aegon the Third ends up being the king. So, you know, Rhaenyra gets probably the better end of this. But you look at Alicent, all of her kids end up dying before she does, right? She has one grandchild left. It completely breaks Alicent, because she sees her entire family die. Her father dies as well. Her brother dies. Nothing goes right for Alicent in this war. Even the after effects, it's not like her line is really ruling at this point, right? So you see kind of the idea of they won the war, but did they? You know, and Alicent is a poetically tragic character because I think a lot of the same echoes in her character will be with Cersei. I think Cersei in the main story is going to go this route where she loses all of her children and she just kind of goes into this phase where she's depressed, she's angry, and then eventually just loses kind of her mind at some point. And I think that is a really good parallel. And I think Rhaenyra and Alicent both kind of parallel Cersei in that regard, because a lot of the same things that I'm talking about with Alicent also kind of work for Rhaenyra as well. You know, I'm just kind of remembering doing my Rhaenyra video. It was one of my favorite videos I've done on this channel. Rhaenyra and Alicent are very similar characters because they go through a ton, and those things that end up happening lead them to do, you know, have bad decisions and stuff like that. And yeah, so I thank you guys all for watching this video. It's a little longer video. I actually had a lot more notes for Alicent going into this video. And let me know if you guys want to see more characters done by me for, you know, the Dance of the Dragons, or even characters within the normal story. And I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys later. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.